servant of God reveals how fasting liberated her from family curses and brought complete restoration. There's a divine power in fasting, not only to cleanse the body, but to break chains that bind us spiritually. In times of struggle when nothing seems to work, fasting becomes a weapon against the forces of darkness. Today, a servant of God shares her testimony of how fasting unlocked divine restoration, breaking curses that had been tormenting her family for generations. For years, her family faced endless struggles. Generations battled the same issues: unexplainable illnesses, financial hardships, and broken relationships. Every effort to break free seemed futile, but she didn't know that the answer was hidden in the scriptures, an ancient solution that could change everything: fasting. One day, seeking God for a way out, she stumbled upon a verse in the Bible that opened her eyes to the power of fasting. It wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about taking authority over the spiritual realm, confronting the curses that had plagued her bloodline, and demanding restoration. God called her to fast, not for just one day, but for 21 days. This would be her weapon to confront the darkness. With determination, she began the 21-day fast. It wasn't easy. The temptations were overwhelming. The enemy fought back with distractions, doubts, and trials. Yet, with every passing day, she felt a transformation, not just in her spirit, but in her body and soul. As the fast continued, the curse that had bound her family began to break. The generational patterns that had kept them trapped started to dissolve. Throughout this journey, her faith was tested. The enemy tried to weaken her resolve, but she clung to the promises of God. She prayed, she wept, and she fought with everything she had. Each prayer she lifted up was like a blow to the chains that had bound her family, and little by little the walls began to fall. As the 21 days drew to a close, something incredible happened. The curses were broken, and restoration flowed in. Family members who had been sick for years suddenly found healing. Relationships that were once filled with strife began to heal. Financial breakthroughs came in unexpected ways, and peace, finally, began to settle over her family. Fasting wasn't just a physical discipline. It was the key to unlocking heaven's power. It was through fasting that God revealed the depth of His love and His desire to restore. The curses were broken, the family was healed, and complete restoration came in ways that no one could have imagined. God's power is real, and fasting can be a powerful tool to break generational curses. If you're facing challenges that seem impossible, try fasting. You never know how God may use it to bring healing and restoration into your life. As the restoration unfolded, she began to see the immense power of obedience. Each prayer, each fast, became a declaration of faith, and God responded in ways she never thought possible. Not only was her family freed from generational curses, but they also stepped into a new season of blessings, a season of breakthroughs, restoration, and divine favor. The transformation was not immediate, but as the days went by, the fruit of fasting became undeniable. Her family's relationships, once strained, now flourished with love and understanding. Financial difficulties that had been a constant battle were resolved. Health problems that had plagued relatives for years miraculously disappeared, and peace filled the home in a way it never had before. But it wasn't just the external change that amazed her. Fasting brought a deeper connection with God. As the days of prayer and fasting passed, she found herself drawing closer to Him, feeling His presence more profoundly than ever before. She began to understand His will for her life and her family's future in ways that were previously unclear. Her testimony became a beacon of hope for those around her. She shared the power of fasting with friends, family, and her church community, encouraging them to seek God's restoration through prayer and fasting. Many who were struggling with their own family curses and generational issues began to fast and pray with the same intensity, seeing similar miracles unfold in their lives. In the midst of all this, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. Gratitude not only for the restoration she had witnessed, but for the lessons learned along the way. She realized that fasting was not just a tool for breaking curses. It was a pathway to greater intimacy with God, a way to lay down pride and self-sufficiency and embrace the fullness of His power. As her testimony spread, more people began to experience the transformative power of fasting. Friends who had once doubted its effectiveness now sought her guidance, asking how they too could break free from the chains that had bound their lives. She shared her story with them, urging them to believe in the power of prayer and fasting, and to trust in God's ability to restore even the most broken situations. For her, the journey didn't end with her own family's restoration. It became a mission, a calling to teach others about the liberating power of fasting. She organized prayer meetings and fasting sessions where people gathered to intercede for their own families, believing that God would do for them what He had done for her. During one such gathering, as they fasted and prayed together, a powerful sense of unity and faith filled the room. People began to confess their struggles, their pain, and their need for breakthrough. They cried out to God, and as the days passed, they witnessed the same miraculous changes. Marriages were healed, health was restored, and financial difficulties were overcome. The atmosphere was charged with the presence of the Holy Spirit, and the room was filled with testimonies of God's faithfulness. Her faith continued to grow as she saw how fasting not only broke curses, but also opened the door for greater blessings. It was through fasting that she had found her true purpose in life, to help others experience the fullness of God's restoration power. Every person she helped became a living testimony of the power of fasting and the grace of God. As she reflected on her journey, she realized that fasting had been the key to unlocking not just physical and emotional restoration, but spiritual growth. It had taught her to rely completely on God, to trust in His timing, and to believe that no situation was beyond His power to heal and restore. And so, her journey of fasting continued. She now lives with a deeper understanding of God's love and power. She walks in complete restoration, and her family, once held captive by generational curses, is now living in the fullness of God's promises. Fasting had not only broken the chains of her family's past, but had propelled them into a new future, a future filled with hope, healing, and divine restoration. God's power is limitless, and fasting, when done in faith, becomes a powerful tool to unlock His promises. The restoration she experienced is available to anyone willing to believe, to fast, and to trust that God's power is greater than any curse or bondage. As the months passed, the impact of fasting continued to unfold in her life. Her story, once a private testimony, became a beacon of hope and encouragement for many who were desperate for change. The people she had helped were now sharing their own experiences, passing on the message of fasting and prayer to their friends, families, and communities. A ripple effect had begun, one that no one could have anticipated when she first started her 21-day fast. The deeper she went into this mission, the more she understood that fasting was not only about breaking generational curses. It was about renewal, a renewal of faith, purpose, and destiny. It was a divine invitation to realign with God's will, to surrender fully to His plan, and to experience the transformative power of His presence in every area of life. Her personal relationship with God grew stronger as she learned to lean on Him for guidance, wisdom, and strength. In her times of fasting, she would spend hours in prayer, meditating on His word, and listening for His still small voice. Each fast became a moment of surrender, where she would offer her heart, her desires, and her life to God, trusting that He knew what was best. One day, as she sat in quiet reflection after a particularly powerful season of fasting, she felt a deep sense of peace. It was as if God was whispering to her, reminding her that the restoration she had experienced was not just for her and her family. It was for others too. She realized that her calling was not just to teach fasting as a practice, but to help others encounter the living God in a personal, life-changing way. This newfound understanding sparked a fire in her heart. She began to host fasting retreats, bringing people from all walks of life together to experience the power of prayer and fasting. These retreats were filled with intense moments of worship, prayer, and intercession as people laid down their burdens and sought the Lord for restoration in their own lives. She watched in awe as families were restored, relationships were healed, and people were set free from the spiritual strongholds that had once held them captive. Through it all, she never stopped fasting herself. She understood that fasting was a lifestyle, not just a one-time event. It was a constant act of devotion, a way to remain humble and dependent on God. Each fast was a reminder of His faithfulness, and each breakthrough was a testament to His power. Her mission was clear: to continue spreading the message of fasting and restoration. She encouraged others to fast with purpose, to seek God with sincerity, and to trust that, just as He had broken her family's curses, He could do the same for them. In the end, her life was a living testimony of God's faithfulness and the power of fasting. She had seen firsthand how it could break strongholds, heal the brokenhearted, and bring about complete restoration. And she knew, deep in her heart, that this journey was far from over. As long as God called her to fast, she would continue to walk in His purpose, leading others to experience the same transformation and restoration that she had found. As her ministry grew, she realized that fasting wasn't just about the personal breakthrough. It was about equipping others to fight spiritual battles and take authority over their own lives. She began teaching on the deeper aspects of fasting, the spiritual discipline of fasting not only to seek restoration, but to align with God's will and step into the divine calling He had prepared for each individual. Her teachings became more profound as she emphasized the need to fast with a pure heart, without selfish motives, but to truly seek God's glory and purpose. She spoke about the importance of fasting with a heart of repentance, forgiveness, and humility, always remembering that it was God's grace that allowed for restoration and transformation. She reminded everyone that fasting was not a magic formula but a surrendering of oneself to God, a laying down of personal desires, and trusting Him to do what only He could. Over time, people who had attended her fasting retreats began to testify of miraculous transformations. Families once divided found unity. Health issues that seemed incurable were healed. Financial breakthrough came unexpectedly. People who had been bound by addiction, fear, and bitterness were set free. Each testimony fueled her fire even more, as she watched God move in powerful ways through the simple act of fasting and prayer. One of the most remarkable stories was that of a young woman who had been battling a severe emotional and mental crisis for years. After hearing about the power of fasting, she decided to step out in faith and join one of the fasting sessions. She began her fast with fear and uncertainty, but after days of prayer and fasting, she experienced a breakthrough. Her mind, once filled with anxiety and depression, was filled with peace. She could hear God's voice clearly, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. Her life was completely restored, and she became a passionate advocate for fasting as a spiritual discipline. As the years passed, she saw the exponential growth of a movement that was bigger than her own story. It was a movement of faith, obedience, and surrender. The message of fasting and restoration was spreading across communities, churches, and even into the lives of those who had never before heard about its power. God was using her to ignite a fire of spiritual awakening, leading countless people to experience the healing and restoration that only He could bring. Her own family continued to thrive in the freedom that fasting had brought. Relationships were stronger than ever, and the generational curses that had once held them captive had been completely broken. Her children, now grown, carried the legacy of their mother's faith and were becoming leaders in their own right, continuing the work of restoration in their own communities. But she remained humble, always remembering the journey she had walked. She never saw herself as the healer. God was the one who had done the work. She was simply a vessel, obedient to His calling, and willing to share the message of restoration with anyone willing to listen. Fasting had changed her life, and now, through her ministry, it was changing the lives of many others. The power of fasting had proven to be a key that unlocked healing, freedom, and restoration, not just for individuals, but for entire families and communities. As she continued to serve God and help others, she always knew that the journey was far from over. The world was full of people in need of healing, in need of restoration, and in need of freedom. And as long as she was called, she would continue to spread the message that through fasting and prayer, God could break the chains, heal the broken, and restore the years the locusts had eaten. As she continued her ministry, the impact of fasting began to transcend her own local community. People from different countries, cultures, and backgrounds started to reach out, asking for guidance on how to implement fasting in their own lives. This global movement was not just about breaking chains, but about a spiritual awakening that was reaching into places she never thought possible. Her influence spread to churches worldwide, and she was invited to speak at conferences, sharing her testimony and teaching about the importance of fasting as a means of breaking generational curses, restoring families, and drawing closer to God. As she stood before audiences of thousands, she would often recall her own humble beginnings, the struggles she had endured, and how it was only through fasting and prayer that she had seen God work miracles in her life. Her story resonated deeply with people from all walks of life, and many began their own journeys of fasting, finding their lives forever changed. Her ministry evolved into a powerful global movement, not just focused on physical restoration, but on spiritual transformation. She realized that fasting was the gateway to a deeper relationship with God, and as people fasted, they not only experienced breakthroughs in their personal lives, but also found a renewed passion for serving others. Churches that embraced fasting saw an outpouring of God's presence and a new fire for outreach and missions. Through this, she understood that fasting was not just about breaking chains in individual lives, but about creating a collective movement of people coming together to bring about the change in the world. She emphasized that when fasting is done with a pure heart, it unites the body of Christ and brings about a corporate breakthrough. The more people fasted, the more God's Spirit poured out, not just in their own lives, but into their communities, churches, and even nations. One of the most beautiful aspects of this movement was how families began to experience restoration together. Husbands and wives, who had been distant and broken, were restored. Children who had rebelled against their parents found healing and peace. Communities that had been divided by strife and hatred began to experience reconciliation and love. People found that fasting, when done in unity, had the power to bring peace to the world around them. Her testimony of how fasting had restored her family and broken generational curses was just the beginning of a far-reaching story. It was a story that would continue for generations to come, as the seeds of restoration and healing were planted in the hearts of those who believed. If her had her quiet moments of reflection, she would often think back to that first day when God had called her to fast. She had no idea that it would lead to such a vast and transformative journey. She knew, however, that this was just the start of what God had in store. There were still so many lives to be touched, so many families to be restored, and so many chains to be broken. The legacy of fasting, restoration, and freedom was being woven into the very fabric of her ministry, and she was just one small part of a much bigger story that God was writing. And as long as God called her to continue, she would remain faithful, teaching others how to fast, pray, and experience the incredible restoration that only He could bring. As the years passed, the fruits of her labor continued to multiply. People who had once been bound by the chains of addiction, fear, and bitterness now walked in freedom. Families that had been torn apart by generational curses now stood united in faith. The once broken and hopeless situations were now filled with the joy and peace that only God could bring. Her ministry expanded further, reaching into places of deep need, both spiritually and physically. She knew that fasting was just one piece of the puzzle. It was a key that unlocked God's power, but it was the obedience, faith, and surrender that activated the full transformation. People came to understand that fasting wasn't just about discipline. It was about aligning their hearts with God's heart, surrendering their own desires for His will, and trusting in His plan for their lives. The impact of her work reached far beyond the physical miracles. Lives were spiritually awakened, communities were revived, and a movement of fasting and prayer began to sweep across the globe. It wasn't just a trend, it was a shift in how people viewed their relationship with God, a deeper connection born out of faith and obedience. She watched as the fruit of her own fasting continued to manifest, not just in her family, but in the thousands of lives touched by the ministry. The generational curses that once bound her family were fully broken, and a legacy of healing, freedom, and restoration was passed down to the next generation. Her children, now adults, carried the torch, teaching their own families and communities the power of fasting and prayer, ensuring the legacy continued. As her ministry began to wind down, she knew that the work was never truly over. Fasting, prayer, and restoration would continue to be vital for as long as the world needed healing. Her life had been a testament to the power of obedience. And now, with peace in her heart, she could see how far God had brought her and her family, from the depths of generational curses to the heights of restoration and purpose. In her final moments of reflection, she thought about all the lives that had been touched. Every breakthrough, every restoration, every life transformed was a testament to God's love and faithfulness. And in that moment, she felt a profound sense of fulfillment. She had been faithful to the calling God had placed on her life, and her story had been part of a much greater story that would continue for generations. The power of fasting had done more than change her life. It had changed the world around her, one person, one family, and one community at a time. And so, as she laid down the mantle of ministry, she knew her mission was complete. God had used her to plant seeds of faith, and now it was time for those seeds to continue growing, spreading His message of healing, restoration, and freedom for all.